Hello and welcome to Boxset, Binge, the Bible from Seven Vineyard, the podcast where we are listening through the entire Bible in a year. My name is Bern, Leckie. I'm joined by Owen, Lynch.
Hi there.
This week we are getting towards the end of the biggest book in the Bible, Jeremiah. It's been quite an epic journey, hasn't it?
Absolutely. It's had everything. It's definitely had the kind of feel of a Hollywood movie about it. Very dystopian in many ways, and yet also a story of hope. But not necessarily structured like a Hollywood movie, right?
No, that's true. So let's have a look back at where it's come from and what we looked at the last couple of weeks, and then we'll ask ourselves kind of what's the point of this story? Where do we find it? It starts off with Jeremiah. He is a true prophet, proper prophet. So he's in the sort of the line of priests that could have been just working in the temple, but God has grabbed his attention and he's passing words to people as prophets do in the southern Israeli kingdom of Judah, the bit that hasn't yet been conquered by the people to the north. And Jeremiah is starting about the time when the last king of that northern empire, Assyria, died. And so it was very surprising for Jeremiah to say, destruction is coming from the north, and repent, which was very hard word to receive. We talked about that 2 weeks ago, and it didn't happen. But Jeremiah telling them that there would be exile coming at the hands of what turned out to be a re-emerging Babylonian empire 20 years later under Nebuchadnezzar. And so Jeremiah was telling everything that people didn't want to hear. They'd be shut out of their homelands, they'd be separated from the temple, they'd lose their centre of life and law and their connection with God, and it would last for generations, 70 years. But then last week we looked in the middle section and we saw that God also has plans for a hope and a future. A very, very famous verse that we love to grab onto ourselves as well. Plans to restore closeness with people, plans to put his writing of his law onto people's hearts. And so people would start to share God's heart. And what's that heart for? It's a heart for restoration. And it's something that God would love us to have too and share with him, which sounds brilliant, but also a bit hard. We talked about it last week too. So that's where we've been, but we've got the end of the story still to come. And if this was a Hollywood film, we would be sort of on the edge of our seats by now, wouldn't we? Okay, but what's the real point of this story? What's going to happen in the end? Oh, I can't wait to find out. The difference between this and a Hollywood story is that in Hollywood stories, you do have to wait to the end to find out. But in ancient stories, most ancient stories, you didn't. You actually met the climax of the story in the middle of the story. You could look at the story as if it was a mountain, and at the summit was the place where the rising action would lead up to. And then there'd be a substantial bit that you'd expect to be of the story where a new life, a life that's different from the old life, you'd want to see what that was. You want to see how it worked. You want to see how people reacted to it. You want to see how people adopted it or what they did with it and what happened next. That would be the point of the next bit of the story. And I think that is how this book of Jeremiah is constructed. And there's a few reasons why I think that, but we could debate it. But how does that sound to you?
Yeah, I mean, when I'm watching a movie, and just particularly like a movie that's clearly got a sequel. Like the Star Wars trilogy, the ones that I grew up with was the sort of the Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi series, and I always got to the end of each movie and thought to myself, oh, that's such a good ending, but I want to now watch the next bit, because I want to know what this new dimension looks like, once, without wanting to spoil it for anybody that hasn't seen the Star Wars trilogy. That's probably no one, but nevertheless, there's that sense of I want to live in the next bit, and I think Jeremiah gives us some of that, doesn't he? In this context, actually, they reach the point where Nebuchadnezzar is going to carry them off into exile, and we actually start to see what it's like. Jeremiah is thought to have lived through the destruction of Jerusalem, in the lead up to it, through it, and afterwards. What I found quite interesting is that is how few people actually get taken off into exile. I don't know if you noticed that, Bern.
I don't know if I read it as how many or how few. I certainly noticed there was a difference, though. There were people who were taken off into exile, were sort of cherry-picked out into exile, including leaders and capable people. We'll read the story of Daniel later, who's one of the most notable people who found a new life and then had to work out what that meant. And there's a big book about that in the Bible. But yes, there was certainly a remnant, and it looked like it was the poorest people who were left in the kingdom. What did you notice happened to them?
You're absolutely right. And Jeremiah himself was left in the kingdom.
He was given the option.
That's right, yes. When we look at what Jeremiah said to Zedekiah, what he actually said to Zedekiah was, look, you better make friends with Nebuchadnezzar. You better kind of pay him tribute because he's going to destroy you otherwise. And I think, therefore, Jeremiah was considered to be, if you like, not a friend of the Babylonian Empire, but at least a sympathetic person. So, like you say, he got the choice, but he decided to stay put. One of the Judeans who was living in the area was appointed governor of the devastated land. And Jeremiah continues to interact with this governor, Gedaliah, until he himself is killed by the remnant, that is the remnant of Jews who actually want to go down to Egypt. And why do they want to go down to Egypt? Well, because Egypt is the other powerful nation in this mix at the time. The Babylonians are more powerful, but the Babylonians are put off from laying siege to Jerusalem the first time just by the possibility that the Egyptians would come and try and defend Jerusalem. But so they're powerful enough to make a difference. But what we discover is that many Jews, many of the remnant, are actually they've hopped off down to Egypt again, which of course is a bit of a recurring theme throughout the Hebrew Bible. When things get tough, the Israelites head off down to Egypt where it's a bit safer.
So that's interesting that people want to do this thing to kind of save themselves.
Yeah.
And so then we have to ask ourselves, well, does that feel like it's sensible? And I would say it probably does, right? You see your homeland being devastated. Why would you want to be there? Let's go somewhere safer. Intriguing then that God says no. And why does God say no? Why is the hardest question to ask in theology? We don't know. But a couple of things grab me about it. One is that going back to the beginning of the account of Jeremiah, the things that's described as what's broken in the old life. In chapter 2, it says, my people have committed two sins. They've forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that can't hold water. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. What does that mean? The old life looks like people just trying to manage everything by themselves in a DIY sort of thing, but it resulted in broken plumbing, essentially, corrupt religion. They were missing the point of what God was trying to do with them. All that was doing was prolonging injustice and suffering. And God wanted them to have a different life from that. God wanted to have this closeness to them, to be the spring of living water that would be installed in their hearts, essentially. So his word then to people who were going and saying, actually, no, we're going to do our own thing. It looks very sensible to us to head off to Egypt. I think there's a couple of things happening there. One is, that's not the life God said he wants for you. If you're going to be a remnant and close to Jerusalem, why not stay in Jerusalem? God is promising restoration to come for Jerusalem. It's not the worst place to be. Second, Egypt is the worst place to be, because let me tell you about what's going to happen to Egypt. And then we into the sort of the final stages of the book of Jeremiah, of all these judgments and things that are going to happen. And they're quite awesome, aren't they? They're quite uncomfortable to read, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think that here we see a sort of mixture of politics and practical politics, and almost like prophetic judgment as well. And it's difficult to kind of separate the two, because what we see in these chapters that we've been listening to is not only is Judah and Benjamin going to be overrun and ransacked by the Babylonians, but so are all of the other small, let's call them nation states around them, including Ammon, Hazor, the Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, and of course the Egyptians and the Syrians. And not surprising. They're all in the very same geographic area as Judah and Benjamin. And what happens is that, you either you subject yourself to the Babylonians and pay tribute to them, or they'll destroy you. And that's pretty much what happens in chapters 46 to 51. We see Jeremiah either predicting or commentating on the horrors that are going to be unleashed upon these nations, and that refuse to bend the knee to the Babylonians, which I find really fascinating. Because it is that kind of political reality interwoven with what Jeremiah calls God's judgment. And I would have been really interested. It would have been horrific, but I would have been a really interested observer of what that looked like.
It'd be interesting in a very uncomfortable way.
Exactly right. Yeah, it'd be horrific. Yeah.
I think it's worth asking the question here where the point of Jeremiah's story is. And the reason why I think this is important is because if you locate the point of Jeremiah's story at the end, it's like, this is what it's building up to, everybody. It's building up to destruction and death for everyone who isn't Israel. Bang, 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 bang. My goodness, it's almost like some people today believe this is the point of this story, that everyone outside of God's people or outside of faithfulness to God is coming to a sticky end. So you better be on board with God in order to avoid that. And so your ticket to heaven, your ticket to being righteous and in the right place in this life is all that's important. And you can expect the destruction of almost everything else. Now, if that's what the point of the story is, that's what it is. I would suggest it's not, because firstly, ancient people saw the point as being in the middle. And what do you see in the middle? You see God's heart for restoration. You see God's heart for renewal. You see God's heart for healing. And you see the promise that this is what's going to be in all people. This is what he wants. This is what's going to happen. This is what's going to come. This is what to expect and hope for. That's the point. Now, not every book is ordered like that. In fact, we're going to look at another prophet where this isn't how that book's ordered. But why I think Jeremiah is ordered like that is because the last sections, everything after the middle, isn't in chronological order. It's not told in time, this happened, then that happened, then that happened, then that happened order. It's ordered out of sequence. You can tell because there's this story quite close to the middle about Zedekiah, who's the last king, that's brought forward. It's brought closer to the middle, I think, because it's important. And why is it important? It's a story about slavery. It's a story about what to do with the slaves. And Zedekiah is given this word, which I would say, because it's here, because this is where it's placed in the book, this is an important word to free all the slaves, all the Hebrew slaves anyway. And he says, okay, yes, that sounds great. We'll do that. But then the story goes on. It didn't get done. Why is that so important? Well, partly because it happened and it was important to, relay that. But why put it here? Why is that so important to put here? I'm thinking it's possibly because it's one thing to say to God, I've heard what you're saying, and that's definitely a good idea, and I'll definitely do that. And it's another thing to actually do it. It's another thing to actually get on with it. And you can imagine how difficult it would be, even for the ruler of a country, to say, actually, I'm going to overturn the slavery system then. Because how many people had slaves? How many people, if they were told you can't have your slaves anymore, would then go back to him, okay, but how is anything going to get done? How are we going to get our work done? How are we going to get who's going to cook now? I don't know how to cook. This is what a slave does, And why should I just let them go free? I mean, what do I get back? They owe me lots of money. That's why they were in slavery in the first place. Where am I going to get my money? All of the practical things that would get in the way of hearing God say, abolish that, and going, okay, yes. I think this is given a place in the story because it's important. And part of the importance I'm feeling is that it's really hard to do some of the things that God says to do. But this is right next to the hope, the point of the story being the hope that we can have that God's promise will come true. And so that doesn't mean that we'll just pick ourselves up and be better suddenly find their own strength in obeying God and being a bit more religious or being a bit more righteous. No, it means that God has to change us. It means that God has to give us that strength to do all those things that he wants us to do. And that's a completely different life from just being religious and being righteous and expecting, destruction and that for everything else. So that's the hope. And I think that's the point.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're pivoting around this point of hope, which is the point that Jeremiah is trying to make here, we see that the nature of the destruction wreaked upon all the nations around Judah is just part and parcel of the renewed hope that Jeremiah sees, not just for the Jews, but for all people, right?
Right. Yes, that is important, how it's for all people and not just for the Jews. Yes.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because, of course, we see judgment on all the nations around Judah, but then Jeremiah prophesies judgment on Babylon. And I think that's really significant because Jeremiah is basically saying that Babylon, in this situation here, the archetypal kind of rebellious nation is actually, this Babylon's not dissimilar from the Babylon we see mentioned in Genesis 11, which was an example, again, if you like, post-creation story. You've got your Adam and Eve, your Noahs and all that. In fact, we have got Noah at that point. And then these people create this city called Babylon, and it's it's a place of great human arrogance and presumption. The sort of example of what people who live without Yahweh as their God would do. And I think what we see in Genesis 11, we see this kind of comparison between the modern day or the present day at that time, Babylon that's destroying Jerusalem and all the surrounding nations, as an example of how not to do it, and actually how this isn't God's way for humanity, and how in fact God will not just although the the actions wreaked by Babylon could be considered God's judgment over Jerusalem and Judea and the nations surrounding, God also has judgment on Babylon as well, and that is almost reassuring. That's part of the hope again, that God will judge Babylon and this remnant will return to Judah to reestablish the kingdom of Judah and Israel. And I think that's really clear, and I don't think Jeremiah really holds back from it, does he?
No. And I think he's going all in with this, not because there's joy in the destruction, no, but because there's joy in the connection with God, and that he's contrasting this way of life where we truly connect with God and we find real strength to be able to do the things that sound like great ideas that we just can't manage to do. And this other way of life where we just follow the flow of, who's looking the best at the moment. And that's a natural thing to do. I do that. Who's looking like it's good to follow? What books shall I read that look like they're kind of wise and popular? There's nothing wrong with reading books and getting ideas in. There's nothing wrong with being part of a good company of people learning from work like that, and all that sort of thing is great. But if ultimately we're defined by we're just going to go with the strongest looking people or the best looking project, and that's going to be who we are at our heart, we'll just get disappointed, right? Because things come and go. And I gotta say, like in my work life, I enjoyed years of being employed by like one of the biggest radio companies in the world. It's great. I got the point a few years into that shouldn't be what's defining me. I shouldn't be pinning that to my identity, because all of that can come and go. And I had to have a sort of a rediscovery, really, of who's God really saying I am? What does he want me to press into? What does he want me to give up? Where is there really life in this? And it wasn't until I was ready to have that kind of sort of look at myself and who I was and who I wanted to become, that I felt actually I was ready to do something even bigger and better, like starting a family and being a dad, which is not the same don't know, doesn't sound like the same scale of things as like, I'm part of this thing where we make billions of pounds or something. But it's so much more important to me now. It's massively more important to me, and I feel it's exactly where God's always wanted me to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting example of where God tends to meet people. I'm struck in Jeremiah 50 by this phrase where Jeremiah describes the people of Israel and Judah as lost sheep on the mountainside. And it's a metaphor that he keeps coming back to. And I was reminded, where else have I heard that? And I was thinking of Jesus, talking particularly as he advanced upon Jerusalem himself, that the Jews were lost again. His brothers and sisters were lost, and they needed a shepherd. They needed someone to rescue them, and that theme is a very strong theme that has run throughout Christianity ever since. The sense that God, Yahweh, is in the business of rescuing lost people, a bit like a shepherd would rescue a lost sheep. There's loads of images of that in the Bible, aren't there? But I think we see that carried forwards into our everyday lives, even now in the 21st century. And you've just described, an example of that, where sometimes we get lost in our own efforts to do something, and actually we lose the point of what we're trying to do. And sometimes it's in the discovery of the point of what we're trying to do that God rescues us. Perhaps because of disappointment, perhaps because of frustration, perhaps because of failure. Where God actually meets us in those difficult places and kind of almost leads us out of that place, like a good shepherd would lead a sheep away from a sort of a rocky edge or something. And that's a big metaphor, isn't it, in Christianity?
It is. I'm just thinking about this whole bigger question, actually. Where is the point? Like, if we were to apply that question to life, we'll get back to our Bible bits in a minute. But if we apply that question to life, I think when I was young, I always felt the point was ahead of me, like discovering what was the point of my life and my identity. So, well, maybe it was ahead of me, and I just didn't know yet. I think we don't necessarily carry on feeling that forever. I think maybe our lives are shaped more like ancient stories than Hollywood stories, because I think it's quite possible that we've encountered the point already. that we're not just waiting to find out, what's the point of me doing all this stuff. That actually we know already, and then most of our life is about just trying to work it out and trying to put it into practice, and discovering that's harder than we thought. But also then trying to process that, not just with ourselves, but with our loved ones and people around us, and other people, and with God, if we're part of if that's part of our belief system or part of our faith community. And I love doing that with people at Seven, that we have discussions about, what is God doing with us, and trying to work that out in practice. Now, the other thing that we listened to this week actually connects really well with that. The Psalms, they're actually split into 5 books, and scholars think that they're not just like randomly organised, but there is very much a structure to what happens with these books. And actually, the book that we've just listened to this week, the 4th out of 5 books, is itself a kind of a turning point. It's kind of a climax almost in the story of the people who were sharing these psalms. These aren't, people think, David's psalms, and the reason, we know they're not, because a lot of them talk about the exile, but it seems to be the collection that was passed around and used and shared and processed during this period of exile that we're also hearing about in Jeremiah. And so it's a really interesting kind of reflection of how did people process their situation when they're suffering like this. How did that sound to you?
Yeah, I agree with you. I've been reading around the scholars on this as well, and it's the same message coming through here, that this is this book, this 4th book in the 5 books of Psalms, really is a response to the crisis in exile. But I always find it interesting. I always think of the Psalms like a work of art, like I was at a museum in Taunton yesterday, the Museum of Somerset, if you were interested. Fascinating history to the county of Somerset, but there was also a local artist whose work was presented in an exhibition, and she lived through some interesting times, particularly World War II, and I was really struck by some of the response, because she painted images of London during the Blitz. And they were very visceral, made you really connect with what was happening through the imagery that she portrayed. And I think of the Psalms like that as the work of the artists, some of those incredible word artists, if you like, that were held in Babylon. And when we read Psalms 90 through 106 and listen to Psalms 90 103 through 106, I kind of, sounds like a radio station, that doesn't it? I'm seeing there, like in 90, what happens when you're in a crisis? Well, you go back to your roots. Well, what's the roots of the Jews living in exile? Well, it's Moses. And reminding that this isn't the first time that the Jews have lived in exile. The Jews were living in exile in Egypt as well, and God rescued them from that.
There's a lot of historical processing of this, isn't there?
Yeah.
It's like, this is where we are now, but do you remember where we've been?
That's right.
and do you remember how we've got here? There's a lot of that in there, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see it working through, like 91, an inspirational poem about God is our refuge, even though we're going through hard times, even though we're in exile, God is still our refuge. 92, remembering with thankfulness who God is and what God means to us, reminding us that in spite of our exile, Yahweh still reigns. Songs of God's power in spite of living under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. There is one more powerful than Nebuchadnezzar, Yahweh, and God is still reigning even though we're in captivity. And then in 94, waiting for Yahweh to avenge the wicked Babylonians, contrasting wickedness and righteousness. That's what we're seeing there. I love it. And then I always think 95 to 104 is kind of like, that's the place where most of the Christian songwriters of my time in the last sort of 20 years have gone to 95 to 104 for some of the lyrics of their songs, right? And I'm sure before that, hymn writers, and before that Jewish songwriters were going to these psalms for inspiration for their own songs. And I love that. I think it's very exciting that we're actually getting a glimpse here of the local artists of their time writing about their experiences and what it meant for their faith in God. I think that's really inspirational, and also, of course, is very translatable into our own lives in this day and age.
I agree. It's very powerful to overhear these expressions. Now, I think we also believe that because we're in the Bible, they're inspired. I tend to think of the Psalms as like meetings that we get to sort of look in on between people and God, where the inspiration, the breath in, comes from God, but actually the bit that you get to hear is the expression of that, the breath out. What do people do in response to this inspiration? Well, these people are sharing their experience. They're sharing what's really on their minds and their hearts. They're sharing their pain and their suffering, but they're also expressing hope and the things that they want to have. And a lot of that then just comes out with expressed hope and praise of God. It's like, we don't know how we don't want to be here, but we do want to be with God. We don't want to be suffering, but we do want all the joy and the hope that we believe we can look forward to, that we believe God's promised to us. And so this sort of combination of divine inspiration and human expression, I think, is really interesting, and something that we can kind of draw a lot of life from ourselves today. I think you're absolutely right on the middle section being like feeling like it's the bit that's like the most ripe for where is life now. And I would point to the middle of this middle section here as the bit that resonates the most for me. Perhaps I'm biased because of my job. So I work for radio stations with new songs. I listen to thousands of new songs every month, and I dig around to find ones that will work for people now, and either on radio or in other places. And so this Psalm 98, sing to the Lord a new song, always resonates for me, like personally. But I think it's also the middle, the climax, the point maybe of this whole section of Psalms 2, that the Lord has made his salvation known and revealed his righteousness to the nations. And in the middle of all this kind of suffering that Israel's having and this judgment that they can expect on their neighbours, the middle of this psalm is all the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth, burst into jubilant song with music. And it's all the earth this is for. Who's it for? Is it just Israel? To say, oh yeah, no, it's just going to be you guys, because you're going to be the faithful ones and everyone else, boom. No. Shout to the Lord, all the earth. And I don't think it's not even just talking to people. It's all the earth. It's like the rivers clap their hands and the mountains sing for joy. All the earth. This is what God's interested in. This is what he's concerned about. This is the point of this whole thing. All the renewal of all the earth, so that all the earth can shout for joy to the Lord. That's the point, isn't it? That's the goodness that's right in the heart of this. And then what I love is how that works itself out in people's. That doesn't make all the pain go away just knowing that, but it does get revealed, I think, when you say, well, are people just sort of have this sort of abstract hope in God for a long time in the future? No. Psalm 102, they're praying for help now. They want to see restoration and hope in their lifetimes. Hear my prayer, Lord. Let my cry for help come to you. Don't hide your face from me when I'm in distress. Turn your ear to me when I call. Answer me quickly. And in the middle of that psalm, it says, my days are like the evening shadow. I wither away like grass. But you, Lord, sit enthroned forever. Your renown endures through all generations. So not an abstract idea about, well, God's just nice and big, but really expecting God now, quickly, to get involved and start addressing injustice and start, yes, absolutely destroying things that get in the way of that, but restoring hope and restoring justice and restoring good life. And that's what we're really after.
Absolutely. Beautifully put. You're absolutely right. One thing comes to mind when you're talking there is that I'm sure that, we are reading here, like, not the kind of musings of the average Joe like me. This is the work of poets. Amazing poets and
inspired poets.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that we could be forgiven for thinking everyone was kind of thinking the same as the poets, that everyone was kind of like feeling, hey, it's going to be fine, no problems at all. But I imagine there were, for as many people as there were hopeful, putting their hope in God, there were probably others who were feeling, just completely downtrodden by the whole experience and at a great loss. And I think that would have been true then as it is now. And I do think that as one of the things that I've noticed amongst Christians over the last sort of 20, 30 years is that there is a growing sense of acknowledgement that the happy clappy kind of Christian kind of thing of always being happy because everything's going to be fine, like it's not felt by everyone. And after I pastored churches for 25 years now, and actually I think that that for every person that's up there's another one that's down, and we all go through periods of depression and heartache in our lives, and there's a psalm for every part of life in many ways, and that's one of the reasons why people love the Psalms so much. But I do think it's just a practical thing, really thinking about our worship as a church, that we're very good at thanking God, celebrating God, remembering who God is. Sometimes we use language which feels a bit out of context and a bit strange. I think that some of our worship songs are not possibly, they make sense in one context but not in all contexts. And I think that that's why actually the role of a worship leader, the person that decides on which songs, whoever that is, whether it's the pastor or the worship leader, is to actually choose songs with lyrics that do really reflect the felt experience of individuals in that group of people. Because the whole point is that we would be able to express our hearts to God in a way that is true for ourselves as much as anything else, yet also reminding ourselves of who God is as well, in spite of our circumstances. So I just think there's a reflective moment there for all people who are involved in leading other people in sort of song worship or liturgical worship. I think it's important to try and deal with that very sensitively and carefully.
Yeah, when I think back about the importance of worship music through history, or certainly recent history, there is a mixture. And it has changed through the years, but I think it is because the music that resonates with people really does address people where they are at the time, and helps people, lift people from where they are to where it is that God might want them to be looking. And sometimes that means old songs sound completely weird to us because, Onward Christian Soldiers Marching Us to War kind of thing was probably great at the time. The other day I was thinking about the song Silent Night, and I'm wondering at what point do we start to play it on a kids radio station that I work for. We've got to play it. We're going to play it sometime. Every year we play it. Normally it's about a week or two before Christmas. This year we've got a new Christmas station starting. Shameless plug. That starts 1st of November, Fun Kids Christmas. And actually we haven't yet decided when to start playing Silent Night. I need to make the point that it's a very enduring, popular song, but also massively historical significance, because it was not even a traditional English song, it's a traditional German song, and it was a song that brought a night of peace between Germany and England fighting, the Allies fighting in the First World War. It was a song that transcended boundaries language-wise and touched people emotionally, all through, and was a sort of incredible transformative moment when people could sing that together, people who were otherwise fighting and genuinely wanting to kill each other. Songs can be amazingly transformational, and then I wonder, well, what are the songs that do that today? I can't quite put my finger on a modern worship song that feels like it's having that same effect, but maybe for different people. I think there are ones that feel very personal to different people, and I think the point of when we worship together on the Sundays is that we're not necessarily playing anyone's favourite music or favourite song, but the question has to be not just what's going to make us feel good or sound nice or be popular, but what's going to connect us with the hope that God wants to give us. What's going to connect us? What's coming from God, in fact, not just from us, but what's coming from God that we can pass on, that addresses us where we are now and takes us to where He wants us to be. And sing a new song, I think, is a really good place for that, because we won't necessarily find it in old songs. We might find it in new songs. Some of those songs we might yet need to be written. Some of those songs God might want to write through us. My hope actually in Vineyard is Vineyard has been a source of new songs, really good new songs, for a long time, and part of what made Vineyard grow initially was its quality of engagement with worship and noticing what the Holy Spirit was doing with people, and finding that back in the 1970s that sort of addressing songs to God rather than singing songs about God made a big difference in worship. That's since been augmented, I think, by things that people have found since, is that there are also great classic songs and other things that God might be saying to us today that don't necessarily fit that template. It's what I'm hearing from Vineyard worship leaders. But what does God want us to do? Well, I don't think we'll necessarily find it in a songwriting class as much as we might find it in the inspiration that comes from everything else, everything that God wants to talk to us about.
What a great place to wrap up our listening of Jeremiah. I think that's a very poignant and important place to wrap up, actually, which is how we express God's heart and how we express our hearts to God. So yeah, it's a great way to end Jeremiah. What are we going to be doing, Bern, in the weeks to come?
Right, so next on our agenda is a different prophet, another major prophet, but where Jeremiah wasn't so sort of massively into all the mechanics of what God was going to do. We don't even hear much about a Messiah or anything like that from Jeremiah. What we do have coming next is the prophet, I think, who's most interested in the mechanics of heaven. That how was God going to do all the things that God was going to promise to do? What exactly would it look like? What would it look like if you could see heaven itself? This is the prophet Ezekiel. And if you possibly can, I would strongly recommend going and listening to Ezekiel. The last time I listened to Ezekiel all the way through was on a long haul flight. You go up above the clouds, spend a few hours just listening to Ezekiel, and it sounds like madness. It sounds like utter lunacy. But there's something about being high in a physically technical sense when you listen to it that could be a good way to listen to it. I'm going to listen to it very much on the ground this time, and I'm going to enjoy it, but I'm going to remember that what Ezekiel's describing is a completely different reality from what we've experienced. And so we need to open our minds to that.
Don't freak out too much. Ezekiel's a very different person to Jeremiah, a very different type of prophet, if you like. So we hope that you can buckle down and listen to that this week, and we'll look forward to discussing the first 21 chapters of Ezekiel next week with you. Until then, take care. Thanks for listening.
Bye.